23rd edition of Chebacco Chats. We're sending this out on September 17th, 2020. And I am presenting some information to you that I've encountered in the time I've been the historian at the Mount Desert Island Historical Society. By the way, my name is Tim Garrity, and that's what I do. I've been at the Historical Society for 10 years, and every year I've written an article for our annual journal, Chebacco. And the first article I wrote was entitled, "John Gilley Fell at the Battle of the Wilderness." It tells a story that I encountered when I worked for a time as a park ranger. And it's a story that developed in my experience giving lectures and doing research and getting to know the people of Mount Desert as they were in the 19th century. So I'd like to share that information with you and tie it to a larger topic in the present day, looking at the lives of men and women in the Civil War on Mount Desert Island and how events of that time had consequences that resonate down to the present. So I want to, let's get this screen shared with you. I think you're looking at my cover slide. You'll see there the signatures of Lorinda and John Gilley, signatures that they put on paper in the 1860s. This story begins when I spent some time as a park ranger in Acadia National Park. I had the assignment of leading visitors on tours of the Beach Mountain area of the park. And the Beach Mountain parking lot sits at the end of Beach Hill Road. And I wanted to give visitors an idea of what kind of people have lived there over time. So there's a very convenient cemetery there, and I sort of invited me to walk in and start to look around. And I came across this gravestone here, the grave of John Gilley. And it says, John M. Gilley of Company D, 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment, fell at the Battle of the Wilderness, May 5th, 1864. And I thought that is a marvelous story written in granite. And I immediately went on my very next hike with visitors and told them of this man and a little bit about the Battle of the Wilderness and how it was a critical encounter during a very important phase of the war that started to turn the tide finally in the favor of the Union forces. I subsequently started to examine some of the details provided here and learned that all is not quite right with this inscription. It says John M. Gilley. Indeed, there was a John M. Gilley who did serve in Company D of the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment. It says that he fell at the Battle of the Wilderness, and I learned in time that that's not exactly true. At the time of the Wilderness Battle in early May 1864, the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment, and John Gilley with them, was about 20 miles away from that battlefield, conducting raids on Confederate forces behind enemy lines, trying to disrupt the Confederate communications with their capital in Richmond, Virginia. So John Gilley did not fall at the Battle of the Wilderness, as his gravestone states, nor did he die on May 5th, 1864. We have the company muster rolls that show that he was very much alive on that day and days following. What we did learn is that he was actually taken prisoner probably on May 12th, 1864. He probably died shortly after, within a few weeks. And chances, it's almost certain that his body isn't located in this grave because of the circumstances of his disappearance. And I thought myself pretty clever to have discovered all this, and I subsequently told a few visitors about this information, how the gravestone is not quite correct, only to eventually be put in my place. And I'd like to tell you how that happened. But let's begin with the story of the Gilley family, because they have left their mark on Mount Desert Island in a number of ways. Here is an 1807 map. It's called the Salem Town Junior Esquire map. Salem Town Junior Esquire, an attorney, was appointed by Governor Francis Bernard of Massachusetts to identify all the settler properties that were claimed on Mount Desert Island and to sort out who owned what. And here you see by Norwood Cove, you know where that is, right? That's where the Causeway Golf Club is. This is where the Causeway Greens are. And William Gilley owned 100 acres on the shore of Norwood Cove. William and Eunice Gilley had 5 sons and daughters, among them Benjamin, who was born in 1798 and also settled by Norwood Cove. Benjamin married Abigail Manchester of Bartlett's Island in 1818, and their first son, John Manchester Gilley, John M. Gilley, was born in 1819. Benjamin and Abigail, John's parents, were married a long time. They produced 12 children, of whom John was the eldest, and Charles, born 22 years later, was the last. Now, some of you might be wondering right off the bat, how is this John Gilley related to the John Gilley made famous by Charles William Eliot in his book, John Gilley of Baker Island? And the answer is that they were cousins. This John Gilley is lesser known than the one that a Harvard president wrote about. And you can imagine this enormous brood of Gilley children growing up on the shore of Norwood Cove and absorbing all the stories that were part of that legacy. For instance, John M. Gilley's great-grandfather was Captain Jack Bunker, who was famous for a bold exploit during the Revolutionary War. At a time when his neighbors were suffering the privations of war, Captain Jack Bunker paddled a canoe more than 100 miles from Southwest Harbor to Wiscasset. He cut a British supply ship out of a fleet anchored in the Sheepscot River and returned with the stolen ship to Norwood Cove, distributing its provisions to his neighbors who were then very much in need because of the privations of war. You can imagine that John grew up among an extended family of Gilleys by the deep blue inlet of Somme Sound in the shadow of Flying Mountain. And think of the children rambling across the fields around Fernald Point and on Norwood Cove, where Captain Jack had returned with his bounty of British supplies. And you can imagine them play acting the 1814 victory of the Islanders over the HMS Tenedos. Both incidents, Captain Jack and the Tenedos, indelible in the memories of adults who would tell them vivid stories. Surely there were some who put their fingers in the bullet holes that were still in the trees by the shore at Norwood Cove and imbued them with this sense of patriotism that later becomes a factor in the life of John Gilley. We know a little bit about childhood in this era because on the other side of Somme Sound, a young boy was also growing up, also born in 1819. Augustus Savage left us a memoir. His grandson Charles Savage, talked about the world that Augustus grew up. Charles wrote, "It is difficult indeed to comprehend the utter stillness that was here in 1832 and the immediate years following. A call or hello from some man to attract a neighbor's attention, the moo of a cow, the sound of a sheep and the clucking of hens, the wind, the distant roar of the sea on a southeaster, an occasional creak of a spar or flapping of a sail when near enough. It was a quiet world back then." A birch tree often reminded Augustus of his brother, who later died at a young age. Augustus said that his brother climbed the tree one day nearly to its top and trimmed off the limbs with a hatchet. And this was a feat in play. Another was to climb a tree and allow the other fellow to cut it down. Often it would be more pleasant for the other fellow than the climber. We have this image of boyhood, of rough and tumble play, and a wild freedom to roam the island. But of course that changes. When John was a young man, he built his first house by Norwood Cove and there brought home the bride of his youth, Mary Dodge Gott. Mary gave birth to a son on November 25th, 1844, but the baby only lived for 3 days, and then Mary died too, about a month later, 2 days after Christmas. She was only 26 years old, one of many women who didn't survive the perils of childbirth in that era. We have a 1860 map that shows that John Gilley owned a plot of land up on Beach Hill. And get yourself oriented here. I'm pointing to Somes Sound and what was then called Dennings Pond, now called Echo Lake, and Great Pond, now called Long Pond. But on that long, beautiful road, have you ever gone down that road in June when the lupin are in bloom? Well, Beach Hill was a very busy place at the time. There was a church, a schoolhouse, a number of neighbors, and among them was John Gilley, who owned a significant tract of land and was a fairly prosperous farmer. We have this image of Beach Hill in the late 19th century of men haying and the mountains in the background. Probably not too far off from the kind of world that John Gilley lived in when he owned his farm on Beach Hill. The agricultural census of 1850 shows that John lived on 25 acres of improved land, in other words, cleared and cultivated with vegetables and crops for the family, and 150 acres of unimproved land, a place where he could let his sheep roam. We know that he had sheep and cows and pigs. He achieved a modest degree of prosperity by putting together, as many people did in that era, a variety of jobs and transactions. He was prosperous enough that he could donate to the Congregational Church, constructed in 1851 shortly after. John Soames gave land for the construction of a meeting house, and a group of men, a short list that included John Gilley, agreed to pay for the construction of the church by purchasing pews. So John left his mark in a couple of places. That first house that he built, that's now the clubhouse for the Causeway Club. And this Soamesville Church is a very familiar sight today. But the world changes drastically in the spring of 1861. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, the country is wrenched apart by opposing forces, North and South. And the Southerners fire on the federal fort of Sumter, Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And then we are at war. And we start to see in the very first days of the war ads like this of recruits wanted for the cavalry, and a passion for patriotism and a desire to preserve the Union swept through the country. Walt Whitman wrote it down in a poem. If you let me picture what this effect was on the community. Whitman wrote, "Beat, beat drums, blow, bugles blow, through the windows, through doors, burst like a ruthless force, into the solemn church and scatter the congregation, into the school where the scholar is studying. Leave not the bridegroom quiet, No happiness must he have now with his bride, nor the peaceful farmer any peace, plowing his field or gathering his grain. So fierce you whir and pound you drums, so shrill you bugles blow. The country was overtaken with this fever for war, and many young men from the community volunteered to join the fight, and John Gilley was among the first. He had a friend write a letter on his behalf, and in part this letter said, "Dear sir, I have a friend in this place, Mr. John Gilley, who thinks of joining a company of cavalry if he can get into one. He is a man about 45 feet, 11.5 inches high, active and smart, meaning healthy, and no lack of courage and of good character. He has a good horse, I should judge, for the service, weighs 1,000 pounds and is 6 years old, which he wishes to put in. If you think he will answer and you know of a company not full, please drop me a line and when he will be wanted in Augusta, with or without the horse. I hope we shall prosper with the war until every rebel is made to lay down his arms and become a good citizen." Now, in joining the cavalry, John Gilley had a little bit of a problem. You know, his gravestone said that he was age 45 years old. Well, that was accurate, but throughout his entire service, the Army understood him to be 7 years younger than his true age. That's because at the beginning of the war, when he was 42 years old, he lied about his age so he could get into a cavalry regiment, where the requirement was that you had to be no more than 35 years old. I think patriotic lies are often excused, but we have this form for examining a recruit. John Gilley is said to be 35. He's a farmer by occupation, born in Mount Desert. He was presented by Charles Hamlin, who happened to be the brother of the Vice President of the United States, Hamlin. And this age discrepancy follows Gilley throughout his career in the service. So he joins the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment. That turns out to be a occupation that is not only dangerous, but also gave him a comprehensive view of the Civil War in the East. Between September 1862 and May 1864, when John Gilley was killed, the regiment marched over 1,200 miles in an area ranging from Gettysburg, Pennsylvania in the north to Richmond, Virginia in the south. The regiment's battle flag, pictured here, lists 36 engagements, an accounting that omits many lesser skirmishes and encounters some quite costly. The 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment suffered more casualties than any other cavalry regiment in the Union Army. In the course of the war, out of the 1,500 men that served in the regiment, 174 were killed and 344 died of disease. So it was truly a dangerous place to be. We have a picture of the Maine Cavalry here. It appeared in Harper's Weekly magazine. They are, of course, dismounted, which was the circumstance when John Gilley was killed. But there was the memories that veterans of the war recalled, of course, acknowledged the horrors of war and the terrible things they saw, but they also remembered these most incredible days of their lives, of great excitement and unforgettable experiences. One wrote of a nighttime ride of the regiment. He wrote, "There we were on a bright moonlit night in a fine stretch of woods, riding horseback, now through mud to the horses' knees, now in water to their bellies, now trotting over and through places that would have made us shudder to walk over by daylight, now getting a switch in the face from overhanging limbs, now losing a cap by the same means, now taking a good smart gallop over a smooth place, now over a stump and round trees, now in a ditch and now over a fence, now jumping a gully, frogs singing, sabers clashing, stars shining, pleasant scenery all the way with just enough excitement to make us fearless. Didn't I enjoy it? I let myself out to the full enjoyment of it and drank to the full of the wild scene. Perhaps this explains why in December 1864, John Gilley re-enlisted. You can see his enlistment statement here. I, John Gilley, born in Mount Desert in the state of Maine, age 37. There again, he's 7 years younger than he really is, and by occupation, a soldier. You can see at a close examination of this document that he overwrote the word farmer. He wasn't a farmer anymore. He considered himself a soldier, and re-enlisted for a period of up to 4 years. Up to 3 years. And one of the benefits of re-enlisting was to receive a bonus, but also leave to come home. And we know that he came home. This is a photograph taken of John Gilley in Ellsworth. You can see a close look on his sleeve shows that he has a sergeant's rank, and also this stripe on his sleeve indicates his re-enlistment. After this visit back to Ellsworth, the regiment participated in what is called the Wilderness Campaign. It was a turning point in the war, a point at which Ulysses S. Grant took over control of the Union Army. And he famously said in a statement that almost anyone who could read a newspaper could quote at the time, Grant said, "I intend to fight it out along this line if it takes all summer." And this is the line that he was talking about. Starting at the Wilderness Battlefield in May 1864, the Union Army constantly moved to the left and the defending Confederate Army constantly moved to the right until they were finally backed up to Petersburg. And all the while, the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment was venturing behind the Confederate lines, crossing the North Anna River, going all the way to Richmond. And we have a more detailed view of the encounter that ultimately led to the death of John Gilley. At a place called Ground Squirrel Bridge, the brigade of a whole division of cavalry, 10,000 men and horses, were making their way towards Richmond. And the 1st Maine Cavalry Regiment was responsible for defending the rear of this line. And that was when the 1st Maine Cavalry burned the bridge behind them and spent the night. But unfortunately, the South Anna River, what was at their back, could be forded. And they were attacked by a group of cavalry from North Carolina. And for the first time in the regiment's history, they wrote, the regiment was completely overwhelmed and they broke and ran for their lives until they could get behind a row of artillery and defend themselves. And in that conflict, John Gilley was wounded and taken to Richmond as a prisoner of war. The regiment went on to a place called Yellow Tavern, which among Civil War historians is better known because it's a place where J.E.B. Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, was killed. And this statue was in the news lately because the statue of Stuart was just taken down as part of the protests against the honoring of Confederate leaders in Richmond. Gilley was taken to a warehouse turned into a prison. We don't know for sure if this is the one, but a tobacco warehouse was abundant. And there he died and all trace of him disappeared. So I thought myself pretty clever to have come up with this story and thought it through and found all this. And I took my wife, some of you know Lynn Bolger, I took her to see this place, this cemetery on Beach Hill Road. And I told her about John Gilley, and she looks at this tableau that we're seeing and she says, "Oh, really? But who's this? And who's this?" Well, this is Mary Gilley. I told you about her earlier. She was 26 years old, and this is their child. Lived only 3 days, never had a name. And this is the grave of Lorenda Gilley, John's second wife, who died at age 43 and lives now on, or is buried now on Bartlett Island. So we start to open up this story, to tell a larger one about the lives of women in this era. And we learn that women had a very important role in supporting the troops by knitting bandages and these materials that went on the back of the soldiers' necks. They were called havelocks to protect them from the southern sun. They worried about Maine men going down there and dying in the heat. And in many other ministrations in support of the war effort, including for morale. Here's a cartoon that appeared in a popular magazine. It says, "Scene Fifth Avenue. Darling, I found a substitute. I've succeeded." And she says, "Have you? Well, I found a substitute for you." The concept of the bullet that wounds twice became current in this time. Once to wound the soldier and the other to wound a woman back home. And that's what happened, certainly, to Lorenda Gilley back home. Women lived in this private world of the home and seldom venture into the public records that we can find them, unless a woman like Lorenda Gilley appears claiming a widow's pension. And it was difficult to do because John had disappeared. She had to have the aged Baptist minister who married them attest that they were married. She had to sign a loyalty oath. She had to prove by way of his company adjutant general that he had indeed died, a loyal soldier of the war. And we look at cemetery markers of this era and compare deaths of women of childbearing age 17 to 45, and men of military age 17 to 45, and learn that female deaths exceeded male deaths by 20%, because this was a deadly and difficult time for women, even though men had entered this maelstrom, this industrial scale killing machine of the Civil War, that John Gilley lived to be 45, yet outlived women with a shorter span of years than his, a first wife who died at 26 and a second wife who died at 43. And this sacrifice of women was called on generations later when the fight for women's suffrage reached its peak. Lucy Stone said, "The soldier risked his life for his country, but in every instance, some woman risked her life that the soldier might be born." And to some degree, justice was obtained finally, 60 years later, with the passage of the suffrage amendment. Yet, in many ways, the circumstances of the Civil War continue with us now in a fight for justice for African American people that was not resolved with the Civil War, was not resolved with Reconstruction, and is with us still. So, as I wrap this up, I think of the historian the Civil War historian who wrote of the men he encountered in his search of correspondence, and he felt like he got to know them better than some of the people around him today. And I feel that way about people like John Gilley and some of the other soldiers that I've encountered, and have come to appreciate that in our community, we have this sense of community that's all around us. But this sense of community can also extend to generations of the past that have made us who we are today, and generations of the future that will inherit what we leave for them. So thank you for your kind attention during this presentation. I see there's one question here, and I'll answer it. If you have any other questions, please let me know. I'll have a look at our Facebook page where we're on Facebook Live, and you can post a comment there. But meanwhile, T. Shore says, "I have a Civil War veterans grave in my yard in Pretty Marsh. Daniel Smith. How could I learn more about him?" Well, the way to learn about a Civil War soldier is to, several things you can do. You can go to the National Archives online. I think they're closed during COVID. I've tried to do some research, and you can obtain that soldier's entire record. Now, Daniel Smith is a tough one. That's a tough surname to have, but it's possible. They will have his record, especially if it happens to list, and it often does on the gravestone, what regiment he served in. If you look at the regiment, it'll say 4th Maine Infantry or 1st Maine Heavy Artillery Regiment. You can just Google the history of that regiment, and often the veterans who survived will have written a very extensive history that tells you everywhere that regiment was throughout the war. So that's a way to do it. And if you would like to talk to me about it, I'd be glad to help and share any information we have. Let's see if there's any other questions. Okay. Boy, I want to say hi to my cousin Carol Garrity watching in Ireland. That's great, Carol. Glad you're tuning in. You've had your own civil war I'd love to learn more about. Meg Gallucci says it appears that so many, like Gilley, originally had an idealized notion of this devastating war to end slavery. And you're absolutely right, Meg. Idealism was the word of the day, and it wasn't long before that idealism wore away for many soldiers. Some of the first to enlist were the first to desert. I perhaps will talk later about a number of people who opposed the war here on Mount Desert Island with a riot in Tremont, and vigorously were opposed to the war or just were tired of it. But many of them, or most of them, slogged through. I guess it's fair to say that as many men were killed among Maine soldiers as deserted. I know when you see the monuments to Civil War soldiers, they emphasize stories of male valor, but this is a very human crowd we're dealing with here. And it was a very tough assignment, especially if you were in the infantry. And often families were suffering back home. And there's no judgment to say what we would have done. Somebody asks, how many GAR vets are buried in the Ledge Lawn Cemetery in Bar Harbor? I don't know that, but you can go around, wander through any cemetery, and what you look for are the bronze stars of the Grand Army of the Republic. The Grand Army of the Republic was the first major veterans organization that was very influential in American national life. And those stars are planted by their graves, and the current American Legion and others make sure that there are flags there on Memorial Day. I don't know that count, but that can be learned. We have the GAR records at the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and we could compare that to Tom Vining's book on the cemeteries of Mount Desert Island, and do a count and figure out where everybody is, which ones are GAR veterans. If you would like to learn that, please get in touch through our website and or in a comment on Facebook. I'd be happy to answer, try to dig into that with you and encourage you to do that research. Well, it looks like our, I think I've gotten to the bottom of the, oh no, here's some more questions. Oh, someone writes that Bill Jensen says, I'm a descendant of the other John Gilley, the John Gilley of Baker Island, and greatly appreciate your interest and time. Well, we're grateful to the Gilley family for the wonderful records that they've left us to help us understand the past. And maybe that's a good a place as any to call this event over. We plan these for half an hour. We've got a great presentation for you next week. Our another historian on board, PhD historian Patrick Calloway, is the collections coordinator for the Mount Desert Island Historical Society, and he has encountered this amazing trove of records and photographs of the Civilian Conservation Corps on Mount Desert Island. So next week, September 24th, 2020, 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time, come see Patrick's presentation on the Civilian Conservation Corps. But that's it for now. Thank you all very much for joining me on this webinar. It's great to have you out in the audience. We'll see you next week.